So today I have Jenny Bhatt, and she is a very, very voracious reader, as you can see from the backdrop. And she has translated a classic Gujarati works. And I would love to know more about Ratnodholi, Jenny. So tell us about the original text, the original work of this short collection of short stories, like you said.
Yeah, thank you, Priyanka, for having me. So, these are short stories by the Gujarati writer Dhumketu. Dhumketu is the pen name of Gauri Shankar Govardhan Ram Joshi. He is known as the pioneer of the modern Gujarati short story. Of course, short stories were being written before he came along, but he took it into the modern era. Now, he wrote 600 plus short stories in like 26 volumes. He's also a very big historical fiction writer. And so he's more well known, I would say, within the Gujarati world, he's more well known for his historical fiction. But I was drawn, because of my mother, I was drawn to his short stories. She loved them, she had the whole collection. And interestingly, I started my writing career with short stories. I mean, I'm writing contemporary stuff, right? But I remember when I was writing my own short stories and I started rereading or revisiting Dhumketu, and I thought, even though his stories are of their time and their place, the themes are very, they're timeless, right? So he's talking about caste discrimination, gender discrimination, classism. Uh, he's talking about issues, even though the stories and the characters are from that era, he's talking about issues that we still talk about today. And his writing was beautiful, even in the Gujarati. So I felt I started initially translating those stories just for my family.
Mm-hmm.
And because I wanted to share it with my nephews and nieces and, who can't read the language. So that's how it started. And then I mentioned it in passing to an agent in India while I was shopping around for my own short story collection. And he jumped on it. And then, it went from there. Now, when I started working with HarperCollins India then for Ratnodholi, which is the collection that came out, and we decided, let's take a best of, because obviously I can't translate all 600. And what I tried to do was I wanted to show the evolution of the writer and the evolution of the short story as through his oeuvre. And so what I did was I basically took at least one story from each of the 26 volumes.
Mm-hmm.
One that I thought was representative enough of his craft, one that I thought would resonate with readers today. And so that's how I came to the translation of those 26. That's how I selected them. And I write about it. I wrote an extensive introduction in the book where I talk about the evolution of the Gujarati short story and how I selected the ones that I did for this collection.
Amazing. I mean, I think some of the translation works these days that are coming up, be it Gujarati stories, be it the short stories of Tagore or Premchand, I think some of them are like really so valuable, especially for the future generations to devour or read through that literature, no? And without the scope of translation, probably those stories will be lost and unheard of, right? So, yeah, I mean, great
Yeah, I mean,
job with
I
that.
think classical literature, although
Hmm.
this isn't, I wouldn't call this classical, it's not
Hmm.
ancient, but I think a lot of our literary culture in other languages is still remains unknown. It's like
Hmm.
buried treasure. And one of the reasons I think it's important to bring those and not, yes, I love contemporary literature too in those languages, but one of the reasons I think we need to bring those buried treasures back into the world is because in a lot of ways they are also sources of history. They
Yes.
tell us about the literary culture of that time. They tell us what were the cultural preoccupations of those people. Now, Dhumketu was writing, for example, right, before pre-independence.
Hmm.
And there were a lot of independence related themes, even though he wasn't writing specifically or explicitly about the freedom movement, but the ideas about freedom, the ideas about self-identity, national identity, regional identity. These are ideas that were there in his works, as they were in the works of his peers. And so I think it's important for us to understand that literary culture because of what it tells us about those times as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, most of the times literature is also like a reflection of that time and age, what's
Yes.
going on in the society, right? So, and sometimes it's also like a first person account.
Yeah.
Like if those authors have lived through those times, then it is almost like a first person account because they have lived in those periods as individuals. Tell us a little bit about your experience of publishing these translated works in the two markets, in India and then followed by in the United States, and how was the response after it got published?
Sure. Yeah, so Ratnodholi was the Indian edition, and that came out in 2020, right during the pandemic
Hmm.
in India. So I wasn't able to come to India to do anything. It was all kind of, virtual or whatever. And HarperCollins, a lot of publishers with translations, the big publishers in India, will take global rights.
Hmm.
So what happens is they had the global rights, which meant that I couldn't come and sell the book in the US.
Okay.
It was up to the publisher to decide whether A, they wanted to do that, or B, who they were going to go to, and they negotiate everything. So and I did that at the time because I mean I want to be writing and translating. I don't want to be sitting here doing all that other work. So
Negotiate
fine,
the deals, yeah.
But what happened was I had just moved to Dallas in 2020 as well. And there's an excellent publisher in Dallas, Texas, Deep Vellum Publishing. They are well known. The publisher, the founder, is himself a Russian to English translator,
Hmm.
award-winning translator, and he has published a lot of award-winning translations. And so for me, I thought, oh goodness, he's right here. And so I reached out to HarperCollins and I gave them the details. I said, Deep Vellum is right here, and I'm happy. Why don't you guys reach out to them, see if they might be interested? And then I had a conversation with the Deep Vellum team as well, and that's a very rare thing the way this happened. It's not common that you're going to find one of the best translation publishers in your backyard, and then be able to approach them. So I wouldn't say this is common and this happens to everyone. So in that sense, my journey was a little bit unique. But the other thing was, I think because I had been doing a lot of book reviewing and writing other stuff before I came to the translation, to some extent, because of my NPR bylines or whatever, my name was a little recognizable. And so the publisher knew, oh, okay, this is who this person is. And he was willing to take a bit of a gamble in a way, because this book is the very first ever Gujarati to English translation to be
Yeah.
published in the US. And
Okay.
that's a big gamble for any publisher to take. It was also the first book-length translation of this totally unknown writer. So with translations, I think that's the biggest challenge, because I think that quite a good number of our Indian literature in English does carry over, does get published in the US. A lot more in the last few years that I've noticed. That's originally written in English, because there is an appetite for that, for contemporary literature that is set in India. But when you're talking about literature that is not contemporary, that wasn't originally even written for an English speaking or English
Exactly.
reading audience, right? There isn't that much of an appetite. I mean, you can see how 2022 was the first time that a South Asian translation won the Booker in
Yes,
2022,
exactly.
right? The first time. Consider how many languages we have, how many books we've had published in translation, and it took 2022 for that's how long it took. So I would say, I mean, the translation ecosystem in the West is still not as open, or not as aware
Mm.
of what's available in India. And so a lot of times I tell translators when they ask me, in a lot of ways, a literary translator is almost like an agent You're a literary agent for your author. Not only are you
Yes,
translating their work, you
but you're
have to go
also
and sell it to
pitch their
people,
work.
you know. Um,
Very true.
so yeah, so I think I mean, so that was my journey getting, and the markets are different. In India, when Ratnodholi came out, even though it was virtual and the pandemic was going on, it did get coverage in most of the major venues, right? The Hindustan Times, and all of them, everybody wanted to talk about it because Gujarati, first time they're seeing that translation, right?
Mm.
Now, in the US, it's different. In the US, only less than 3% of the total published books in the American market
It's
are
translated.
translated. Less than 3%. Now, so you're competing with a lot of other books that are published in English. And so a lot of the media coverage that happens, whether it's, the best books of so and so to watch out for, or the best books to, all those best books lists
Mm.
and um, interviews and all of that, very little coverage, even for translations from European languages, right? So forget an Indian language that nobody can even pronounce, Gujarati, what is that? Dhumketu, they can't even pronounce. So it's harder, much harder to get attention for a translated work from India in the US.
But you must be really proud to have at least put the foot in the door and at least get the ball rolling, no?
Yeah, I worked, I, I was telling my HarperCollins publisher, because I have a couple of other projects that are overdue now. I need to finish translation projects. That the reason I'm overdue is because last year I spent a longer amount of time, um, more time in the promotion cycle for the US edition than I had expected.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I hadn't thought it would take that much, but it did. And it was a lot of hustling. It was,
Yep.
reaching out to folks saying, hey, I have this book and, I think it would be interesting to the South Asian diaspora. Gujarati is the sixth most spoken language in the world and the third most spoken
In the
in the
US.
South Asian American diaspora, the third most spoken.
Wow.
And
Yeah,
yet,
of course. We all know there are a lot of Gujaratis in the US, right?
exactly, right? But you know, people don't know about Gujarati literature or Gujarati culture. And most
Mm-hmm.
of those Gujarati folks don't read in the original Gujarati, so they can only
Absolutely.
read in the translation. So yeah, so it was a lot of hustling, a lot of work. Yeah.
Well done, Jenny. I have a very offbeat question, and it is
Mm.
about languages. So,
Mm.
so you are probably raised in India, and then you moved to the US. So you would have learned Gujarati as a mother tongue. But when it comes to writing, when it comes to literature, um, do you really have to have like a primary language of expression? And how did you like come to terms with it that there is a foreign language at the end of the day, which I have, of course, like for Indians, English is pretty much becomes like the mother tongue at some point. But how does it impact your writing? How does it impact your identity, the way you see yourself, the way you express yourself? I would really love to know a little bit about it.
Yeah, this is actually a good question, a very good question, and I'll try and keep the answer short enough because there's a long answer as well. So yes, you're right. I grew up in India. I went to English medium schools, like most people. Gujarati was the mother tongue, or is the mother tongue, but it was spoken at home. Now, I didn't learn Gujarati formally. What happened was when I was at home for the school holidays, and I would run out of reading material because we didn't have a library nearby and we didn't have that many books at home either. But my mom had Gujarati books. And so she'd be like, go read that. And I'd be like, oh, I can't read that. And she said, oh, I'll teach you Gujarati. And so she taught me the script. She wrote the Hindi script and then she wrote the Gujarati alphabet. And then I learned to read that way.
Yeah,
So I learned to read. Okay, just because I know how to read the language doesn't mean I can translate, right? What
yeah,
translation is a whole skill set.
yeah.
And what happened, how I got into translation was I left India as a teenager to go study engineering, right, in the UK, and then I worked in Europe. And this was back in the days before the internet, okay? So, there wasn't email or anything. So I would get long handwritten letters from my mother. Now, it was hard, and she would write in Gujarati. She would, even though she could write in English, she'd be like, nope, I'm going to write in Gujarati, so you have to read it. And I'm telling you, and I couldn't just pick up the phone back then. Trunk calls were expensive. So I would literally sit and transcribe first because her script was a little, curly and all this. So I learned translation first by transcribing.
My mother's letters.
Yes. And then I had a dictionary. I told her, you're going to have to send me a dictionary because I can't. Some of these words you're using are highly Sanskritized. Because she used to study Gujarati literature at university. She dropped out because of marriage. But so I would say to her, you've got to send me a dictionary. So then I started, I would read, go through the dictionary. And so I was translating. My first act of translation was my mother's
letters.
Yeah. Then slowly, I felt more confident, and then I started to get Gujarati books that she would parcel to me. And so, it was something I did purely for pleasure, for my own. And this is one of the things I've talked about with a couple of other folks. Linguists talk about this thing called subtractive bilingualism. And what that means is when you are learning one language, or you are immersed deeply in one language, and you start losing another one at the expense of this one,
yes,
it's subtractive bilingualism. And so that's what happened, because I was so immersed in English. English was the language I studied, I worked in, all around me. I was in outside of India, I was in Europe, and so all around me it was all English, right? And so what happens is the Gujarati starts to fall away. And language is such an important part of our lives, right? We communicate from a very early age. So for me, that bit of translation that I was doing, or reading Gujarati texts that I was doing, it was also a way to connect back to my home and roots through the language. So it meant more to me. I wasn't just doing it, oh, I enjoy reading this Gujarati story. Sometimes I didn't even understand it because the language was so hard.
Yes.
But I would read it. I would read and then go look it up, because just that act of doing that made me feel connected back, to home. You know how some people, when they go abroad, for them, they start cooking all the Indian dishes because food is a way to connect. For me, food wasn't the way. Language was the way.
Yes, yes.
And I think it's because with writers, language is one of the important ways we connect, right? So yeah. So I think, to your point, I don't think you become a translator just because you know another language. I mean, everybody in my family can speak at least 3 languages. Right. Doesn't mean they're translators. And if you were to look at my early efforts at translation, they are terrible. It's literal translation. And that's not how you translate. So there are skills and there's a craft to it, which you learn. If you're lucky enough, like Daisy Rockwell, you can go to a university and learn it and have people around you who can teach you and help you. Or you can be like me, who comes to it at the age of 50.
No, I mean, the point is that you never really planned to become a translator. It's just that how you felt connected back to your original mother tongue. And then basically for translation, it's important that you connect with both the languages equally and to the text equally, and not just at a knowledge level, but also there has to be some kind of connection with the language also. Like today I can learn German as much as I want because I live in Germany, but I don't know if I can ever get connected to that language to an extent that it is really like part of my thinking or part of my expression, right? So
yeah. I mean, I studied German at university for 2 years, and I worked in Berlin.
Oh,
I
that's a
translated
coincidence.
technical texts. I wrote my final year thesis in German.
Wow.
Do I feel connected to that German? No. I mean, I did it because I had to. And chances are, if I had lived there longer, maybe I would have felt some connection. But I think that connection we have to our heritage, to our mother tongue, is a whole different thing.
Yes.
That, I will say, I just want to clarify, there are translators, very good translators, I know, who are not heritage translators, meaning they are not translating from their mother tongue. I mean, Daisy Rockwell is a good example, right? Hindi, she only came to it at university. She said, she even talks about it in interviews. She talks about how she would never have even become a translator or taken up Hindi. It just happened that when she was picking classes for her university roster, Hindi was available for the slot that she had open when she was choosing her classes. And it just happened. It was serendipity, you know. So, I mean, I think, so I know a lot of good, excellent, amazing translators who didn't come to translation for their mother tongue. So they don't have necessarily that connection, you know, that you're talking about, but they develop that interest, or they develop that because they have a love for culture or world literature, whatever. But you're right that for those of us who are translating from our mother tongue, it's a different thing. And for me, I've talked about this before, for me, translation is also an act of reclamation. It's an act of recovery. Because Gujarati is, when you look at the South Asian translation pyramid, the languages at the top are Bangla, Hindi, Tamil, you know, Kannada, Malayalam. And Gujarati is somewhere at the bottom. It's not, you know, even Marathi is higher. Rajasthani is doing better now. But Gujarati, because we just don't have enough translators. And you know what happens when you don't have, and we're even losing readers in the Gujarati language. So the Gujarati literature is not flourishing and growing because you don't have enough readers. And they say that one of the ways that a language dies is if the literature dies or starts to, you know, not flourish. The other is when people stop reading in that language.
Yes.
That's actually one of the main, ethnographers will, or anthropologists will tell you that that is one of their main signals they use as a measurement, is how many people are actually reading and writing and speaking and learning the language. And if, as that number gets smaller and smaller, that language becomes endangered.
Correct.
And Gujarati is an endangered language for that, despite the number of speakers. It is becoming an endangered language because people are not reading in it, people are not writing in it. Yeah. So.
Very true. So what next, Jenny? What are you doing next? Do you have more interesting Gujarati books to be translated, or are you writing your own short stories now, or own novel now?
I've done the short story collection. I'm not writing short stories. I'm working on a historical novel set in medieval Gujarat. But I'm also translating. There's two projects I have. One is folklore. Javed Chand Meghani is a Gujarati writer. This is what he did around independence time. He was very well known even as a freedom fighter. And Gandhiji had called him the Rashtriya Kavi, you know, national poet. But he, around the time of independence, what happened was he felt that because of industrialization, because of colonization, Gujarat was losing its literature and folklore, you know, the oral traditions. Okay. It was all getting lost because people were leaving the villages, going to the towns, and nobody was telling these stories anymore. And we would lose all that. And so he spent years traveling around rural parts of Gujarat, collecting all these folk stories. And he put them in 5 volumes called Saurashtra Ni Rasthar. Now, I'm not translating all 5. I'm doing a selection from them, but I am translating those because, again, I think folklore tells us a lot about our culture. Folklore tells us more than what it was considered serious literature, because folklore is the common stories that common people told each other, right? They are the stories that people told each other when they were putting their kids to bed at night. And so that tells us a lot about our culture back then, right? The history. Correct. So that's one project. The other one is a big historical novel set in Gujarat by the celebrated novelist Varsha Adalja. She's won lots of awards in Gujarati. She has only been translated maybe once in her entire career of 55 plus books. And this novel, she wrote it in her 70s. It's a 600-page novel. And it's set in Gujarat during the time of independence. And, you know, it's one of the rare novels to be set in Gujarat. And when you think about Gujarat gave us 2 of our biggest independence leaders, Gandhi and Jinnah.
And Patel.
And Patel, 3. So Jinnah also came from Gujarat. Jinnah was Gujarati. Yes. He was Muslim Gujarati.
Right.
So Gandhi, Jinnah, Patel, all of them came from Gujarat. And we have very few novels set there that people know about. And so that's one of her novels is Crossroad. And that's what I'm translating as well. And then, yeah, those are my projects. I teach writing workshops for a living because I have to pay the bills. And so that's ongoing. And then I used to run a platform called Desi Books for 3 years, where I tried to spotlight the writers that didn't get covered by mainstream media, but they brought diverse literature from India. It wasn't the usual, what I call, the Slumdog Millionaire kind of book that Western people think we need to have. That's what India is. They have that stereotype of India, right? But there's a lot of other books being written as well, and thankfully being published. So I was doing that, but I just had to close that down in February because things got a bit busy for me, and I got to work on my own projects. So yeah.
Wonderful, Jenny. Thank you so much for your time. It was lovely talking to you. I think it's my first time I'm talking to someone who has translated books, translated Gujarati novels
Ah,
and Gujarati stories. I also grew up in Gujarat and spent a lot of time in Gujarat. So I'm also
lovely.
familiar with the language a little. I know it's very close to Hindi. I can also read it a bit. But yes, it's a very rare opportunity. And thank you very much for
Thank you.
being
Where,
there and
where in
continue
Gujarat
the
were
good
you?
work.
Yeah,
I grew
thank
up
you.
in Baroda. I grew up in
Baroda.
Baroda. I studied in the Sayaji Rao University. So
Oh, so okay. So I just interviewed Dr. Sachin Ketkar, who teaches there now. And that interview just came out yesterday at Words Without Borders. I'll send you a link.
sure.
Yeah,
I
so he
passed out
teaches at
almost
Sayaji Rao.
15 years ago, 15, 20
Right,
years
right. So
ago.
yeah, he
But
he probably went after you left.
okay,
But I mean, he's doing some great work there. And just for your awareness, you might want
amazing. Thank you so much and have a
to.
very
Thank you.
nice day. Bye bye.
Thank you.